This presentation will prepare you to work with VR counselors to support them in implementing best practices for working with students with disabilities. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act requires vocational rehabilitation agencies to set aside at least 15% of their federal funds to provide pre-employment transition services to students with disabilities who are eligible for VR services. These services have 5 required elements: job exploration counseling, work-based learning, counseling on opportunities for enrollment in comprehensive transition or post-secondary educational programs, workplace readiness, and instruction in self-advocacy. Pre-employment transition services are not required to be provided to all students with disabilities who qualify for VR services. Rather, the 5 service elements must be available statewide, so students with disabilities can access one or more of them. Job exploration counseling is the act of helping students become aware of career options and pathways, and of how work-related values apply to employment outcomes. Job exploration counseling may include exploring vocational interests, potential careers and career pathways, activities that recognize the relevance of a high school and post-school education to their futures, both in college and/or the workplace, and the labor market, particularly industries and occupations in high demand. Work-based learning is an educational strategy that allows students to participate in real work experiences that can be applied to academic and technical skills. Work-based learning may include informational interviews, career-related competitions, presenting careers through simulated workplace experiences, apprenticeships, job shadowing or career mentoring, paid work experiences including internships or employment, and unpaid work experiences. Counseling on opportunities for enrollment in comprehensive transition or post-secondary educational programs includes providing information on things like course offerings, career options, the types of academic and occupational training needed to succeed in the workplace, post-secondary opportunities associated with career fields or pathways, academic curriculums, and college and financial aid process and forms. Since the objective of the literature review was focused on transition to employment, this category was covered under job exploration counseling. Workplace readiness training refers to common social skills used in employment that are needed to maintain appropriate interactions with managers and colleagues across all workplace environments. Example social skills may include effective and professional communication skills, including timely and professional communications, understanding employer expectations for punctuality and performance, appropriate communication skills, showing respect and listening, teamwork, cooperating and supporting others, positive attitude, making decisions and problem solving, and professionalism through good manners, professional body language, timeliness, and a positive attitude. Self-advocacy refers to a person's capacity to communicate his or her interests. Self-determination, on the other hand, refers to people's ability to plan their lives on the basis of what's important to them. These skills may include understanding oneself, understanding one's disability, ability to disclose one's disability, decision-making, identifying independence, identifying necessary accommodations in the workplace, requesting and using accommodations, understanding one's rights and responsibilities, and knowing how to request assistance and requesting it. Note, self-determination refers to a person's ability to plan life according to what he or she values. Recently, there has been an increased focus on understanding the ways that youth from different cultural or linguistic backgrounds experience the services provided through WIOA, such as Pre-ETS. For example, studies have tried to understand the ways diverse cultural backgrounds can affect an individual's willingness or ability to disclose his or her disability. In a recent review of the existing literature, researchers concluded that students with disabilities from minority cultures and who spoke minority languages faced unique challenges with self-advocacy. As a result, the researchers recommended that these students with disabilities be given special attention in developing these skills in the context of their cultural and linguistic identities. Many culturally or linguistically diverse families have experienced a lack of cultural reciprocity in their interactions with special education and transition personnel. As a result, they report encountering racial and cultural stereotypes and biases, lack of knowledge about immigration issues and language proficiency, and a lack of respect for themselves and their children, as well as their hopes and dreams for their children's future. While the importance of encouraging skills such as self-determination and self-advocacy for post-transition success is well substantiated in the literature, encouraging these skills may be perceived as culturally insensitive or inappropriate by some families of students with disabilities. When a transition counselor asks a student with disabilities to engage in a skill or behavior that differs from her family's desired behaviors, this can result in a cultural bump or moment of discomfort caused by a misunderstanding around cultural norms. So how should a counselor help the student develop the behaviors that might result in higher rates of post-transition success while avoiding cultural bumps? Now that we have provided a brief overview of the 5 requirements for pre-employment transition services from WIOA for students with disabilities, as well as the importance of being culturally sensitive, we will discuss what the research says. It is our understanding that not all VR agencies have counselors providing the pre-employment transition services as outlined by WIOA. Please note that, although the research findings and best practice recommendations are focused on the 5 pre-employment transition service elements, the information contained within this module can be applied to the transition process in general and does not strictly adhere to the 5 service elements. The National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research funded the American Institutes for Research's Knowledge Translation for Employment Research Center to conduct a literature review that examined successful methods that VR counselors could leverage to support employment outcomes for students with disabilities. Literature and products such as research-based trainings were examined to identify themes based on research that have been found to improve employment outcomes. We categorized the research into the 5 pre-employment transition services, but found that the research relating to counseling on opportunities for enrollment in comprehensive transition or post-secondary educational programs was either very similar to the research related to job exploration counseling or not focused on employment outcomes. Therefore, we focused on 4 of the 5 categories. In this module, we'll be discussing job exploration counseling strategies that VR counselors can leverage to improve employment outcomes for students with disabilities. Job exploration counseling is multifaceted in scope. Because of this, more than often, multiple overlapping strategies need to be used when assisting students with disabilities. When reviewing the research on this topic, 4 characteristics emerged: career goal development, involving family, cultural reciprocity, and interagency collaboration. Even though the development of career goals can be achieved through a variety of ways, they all ultimately serve the purpose of helping individuals explore career interests through setting achievable vocational targets. Maintaining career goals can help transitional youth achieve employment outcomes. One study evaluated a transition program in New York State and found that students who developed measurable post-secondary goals in their education plans were twice as likely to participate in work experiences as their peers. Because of the employment knowledge and experience VR counselors bring to the table, this study stressed that VR counselors could provide invaluable insight in informing the development of post-secondary and employment goals. Another study noted that special education programs might not have the career development interventions available to assist with identifying vocational goals. To remedy this, VR counselors should begin working with schools as early as possible to help develop career-related activities, which should include identifying vocational goals. Overall, 4 studies highlighted the importance of VR counselors' involvement in the development of career goals for students with disabilities. Family involvement occurs when a VR counselor makes an effort to communicate with family members or guardians to get a better sense of a student's aspirations, which include career goals. Parents often know their children's interests, goals, and dreams better than anyone else. This remains just as true for parents of children with special needs. Connecting parents of students with disabilities to VR counseling can help both sides of the equation gain a better understanding of the youth's career aspirations. One study stated that some parents were under-equipped when it came to helping their children find employment. This study suggested that VR counselors work together with parents to provide support and help facilitate the job process. A literature review that explored transition outcomes stated that transition personnel should familiarize themselves with the broader cultural community of the family when developing a comprehensive transition program for culturally and linguistically diverse students with disabilities. Overall, 5 studies highlighted the importance of VR counselors involving family in the career planning process. One study looked at VR personnel's beliefs about strategies that successfully facilitated the transition from school to employment and found that involving parents was essential to the process. The 3 primary practices to engage and establish relationships with families were using a combination of phone calls, letters, and home visits, with families that were culturally and linguistically diverse, speaking in a way that reflected respect, and being flexible and accommodating the logistical barriers of family involvement. Cultural reciprocity takes into account the cultural and situational factors that affect one's life. In regard to students with disabilities, these factors can directly affect employment. Students with disabilities come from various cultural backgrounds and all walks of life. Understanding how cultural context shapes and influences career aspirations is undoubtedly important for VR counselors. One of the studies conducted interviews with 17 employment specialists to identify the core practices they used to help students with disabilities find employment. Cultural competence was identified as a key attribute. The study stated that the employment specialists interviewed displayed a commitment to understanding the youth's life circumstances and took the time to learn about their support systems within and outside the family. These employment specialists also demonstrated an understanding of how cultural and situational factors could influence employment. For example, students with disabilities who lived in high-crime areas might have more difficulty getting to and from work. Overall, 4 studies cited cultural reciprocity as a practice important to VR counseling. Cultural reciprocity and family involvement often work in harmony. In practice, culturally responsive transition planning allows a transition counselor to mediate between the different visions of the future that the student with disabilities, the family, and the counselor himself or herself may hold. This kind of planning allows the counselor to take into account all perspectives and try to find common ground. One of the most important things the counselor can do is to be sensitive to the basic survival needs of the family. Some families may expect their children to primarily help around the house once they finish school, or work at a family business. It is important to understand that the work the child will perform may be essential to the family, and to take this into account while coming up with a transition plan for the student with disability. The family may also be unfamiliar with special education law and the many different ways that this can affect both the students with disabilities and themselves. By ensuring that parents understand special education law, it is more likely that the students will be encouraged to take advantage of the opportunities that it affords. Finally, it is wise to involve a bilingual, bicultural interpreter who is familiar with the cultural perspectives of the family in order to negotiate any unforeseen cultural bumps. Interagency collaboration happens when stakeholders and related agencies work together to improve services and solve problems. For students with disabilities, many stakeholders and agencies exist to help them succeed in career and in life. Nevertheless, collaboration among these agencies must be well aligned in order to achieve maximum success. 11 studies emphasize that VR counselors should be working alongside the family, schools, and other related stakeholders to achieve the best outcomes for the students with disabilities they serve. According to 2 of these studies, the earlier such collaborative relationships are established, the better. For instance, one of the studies stated that the establishment of cooperative agreements between VR agencies and local education agencies can help students with disabilities get an earlier start in the transition planning process. The other study suggested that VR counselors begin working with special education personnel as soon as possible to assist with career-related activities and interventions. Research has shown work-based learning to be an effective educational strategy that can lead to employment. When reviewing the research on this topic, 3 characteristics from the findings emerged. Previous or early work experience can lead to employment. Supplemental Social Security income payments can impede employment. And mentoring and other work-based social supports can lead to successful employment. Previous work experience is any work-related experience that a student has engaged in before graduating from high school. This includes previous paid employment, internships, and volunteer or community work. VR counselors can help students identify internships, volunteer activities, and short-term jobs for students to participate in. When it comes to future employment for students with disabilities, work-based learning experiences can play a critical role. 9 studies discuss the value of previous or early work experience in supporting employment post-transition. For instance, 3 of those studies reported that paid work during secondary school predicted employment following graduation. 4 studies identified the skills learned in practical on-the-job situations as the primary benefit of work-based learning. While participants in all these studies cited internships or other time-limited transitional employment as a good way to gain this experience, VR counselors who participated in a series of focus groups recommended developing and practicing interviewing, communication, and job readiness skills in a variety of different ways, including camps, summer jobs, school-sponsored work activities, after-school employment, volunteer work, job shadowing, supported employment, on-the-job trainings, and internships. Supplemental Social Security income payments are benefits that disabled adults and children with limited income receive. For VR counselors to assist students with disabilities effectively, they need to be familiar with the different kinds of barriers that can impede employment. 4 studies discussed the role that supplemental Social Security income plays in encouraging or discouraging employment among students with disabilities. Each of the studies identified supplemental Social Security income payments as a negative predictor of employment. 2 of the studies looked at a program that offered waivers of certain supplemental Social Security income rules. One of these 2 studies evaluated 3 different waiver programs and found that they led to better employment outcomes for students with disabilities. At the same time, access to supplemental Social Security income may be critical to some individuals with disabilities. Mentoring and other work-based social support includes advocates who support students with disabilities in a workplace setting. These can include formal mentors, implicit or formal role models, or any person in a position to advocate for students with disabilities. 5 studies cited the importance of work-based social supports, such as mentoring and role modeling, as an important factor that can lead to successful employment. In one study, students with disabilities reported increased self-confidence following an employment training program, which some youth attributed to their contact with peer mentors. Furthermore, both parents and youth in the study said that they would have liked to continue with a mentor or buddy system after the program ended. In another study, VR counselors who participated in a focus group suggested providing visually impaired youth with both blind and sighted role models as a means of developing positive social skills. VR counselors need to be aware of the types of social supports that exist for students with disabilities and develop strategies to identify potential role models, mentors, and advocates. Research shows that workplace readiness can also lead to employment. When reviewing the research on this topic, 3 characteristics from the findings emerged. Communication and interview skills are critical for obtaining employment. Social skills supports are imperative, and transportation proficiency is a factor in employment. Communication and interview skills are the skills needed to support successful employment through interactions with potential colleagues and customers. These skills include such activities as listening, following directions, understanding expectations, presenting a positive attitude, making decisions, and problem-solving. 9 studies reported on the area of social communication and interviews as important for students with disabilities obtaining employment. A general conclusion of 4 studies reporting on communication skills for job interviews, cultural differences, and general interpersonal communication indicated that communication competencies were important to students with disabilities, or emerged as predictive factors for successful employment post-school. VR counselors should leverage communication exercises, such as mock interviews, to help students with disabilities develop the skills needed to support successful employment. Social skills are the social interactions required to function and collaborate successfully with superiors and peers. These skills may include, but are not limited to, such social graces as showing respect, being helpful, requesting assistance, managing time, maintaining good hygiene, and dressing appropriately in the workplace. A total of 7 studies were identified as addressing the topic of social skills in terms of development of, need for, or barrier to successful transition programming for students with disabilities. Social skills training for students with disabilities mostly addresses work performance and successful relationships with coworkers, employers, and customers. One study found that social activities in relation to peer interactions were meaningfully related to post-school employment. Similarly, another study found that social skills affect how students with disabilities understand the use of social skills at work, home, and in social life. Social skills cover a vast range of different skill sets, which means it is important for VR counselors to be able to both identify the kinds of social skills their students with disabilities need to improve and the opportunities that exist to improve them. For example, work-based learning, mock interviews, and occasions to interact with peers. Transportation proficiency refers to the ability to successfully traverse different modes of transportation to reach a specific destination. 7 studies identified the importance of transportation proficiency. 2 of those studies reported that transportation and travel independence were statistically significant predictors for post-school employment for the visually impaired. 3 other studies found that difficulty with transportation was a significant predictor of failure to achieve post-school employment. VR counselors should help their students with disabilities become familiar with different modes of transportation. This could involve practice taking the bus, train, or other methods of getting to work. This section will go over best practices for self-advocacy, a pre-employment transition services requirement under WIOA. Some potential barriers that students with disabilities might experience to self-disclosure and advocacy center on the lack of knowledge about the kinds of protections available to them, or even about their disability itself. This is a problem because students with disabilities must be aware of what accommodations and protections exist before they can self-advocate to receive them. After looking at the literature, 3 key areas were identified as addressing self-advocacy: self-determination, disclosure, and workplace accommodations. Research also showed that there is a clear and consistent need to involve students with disabilities in discussions of the risks and benefits of self-advocacy. Self-determination, a concept closely related to self-advocacy, has been linked to an increase in a person with disabilities' quality of life. Self-determination is an integral part of quality of life and is included in Shallock's definition of the 8 core quality of life domains. While quality of life is subjective, it is measured through the domains of satisfaction, competence and productivity, empowerment and independence, and social belonging. When people with disabilities show higher levels in these domains, they are likely to have a higher quality of life. Because self-advocacy and subsequently self-determination are important to an individual's quality of life, we should figure out how to ensure that students with disabilities have the skills necessary to advocate for themselves in the workplace. 3 studies indicate that one of the benefits of self-advocacy training is that students with disabilities learn to identify potential accommodations that they can access to support gainful employment. They also learn what their rights are if they happen to be discriminated against in the workplace. As a best practice, VR counselors should look for and suggest opportunities that will allow students to exercise their decision-making skills. This could include having them create academic or career goals, developing schedules, thinking through post-high school aspirations, and so forth. Likewise, studies have shown that students who disclose their disability are more likely to remain employed after they leave school. However, these same studies also note that only low levels of disclosure training are available to students with disabilities. This means that there is a need for stronger trainings in disclosure skills to be available for all disability types and levels of severity. To meet this need for stronger disclosure trainings, studies recommend that students receive transition orientation services while still enrolled in high school. Requesting appropriate workplace accommodations is a skill that can help students with disabilities find and maintain employment. Students with disabilities may not be aware of the accommodations that are available to them in post-secondary education or that they can reasonably ask for in the workplace. VR counselors should ensure that the students with disabilities they work with are engaged in activities that support identifying potential accommodations. This might include going over with students with disabilities what accommodations are available in the workplace and having them identify what accommodations they need most to succeed. Having students with disabilities practice asking for workplace accommodations in mock settings might also help them develop the self-advocacy skills necessary for making these types of requests.